Hi everyone, we are getting ready for your next LEQ test, and the topic will be about comparing the first and second Great Awakenings. So let's get started. Just a little refresher here about the first Great Awakening, which we covered probably about a month or so ago. So why does it start? If you recall, the early Calvinists were very strict in terms of their religion, whether they were Anglican and or Puritan. They felt it important to have religion a part of their life almost every day. When we get into second, third, and fourth generation colonists, you're starting to see that they're slipping away from maybe going to Mass on a regular basis, and they're no longer really believing in predestination. So preachers will pretty much travel all 13 colonies. Some obviously will stay in some areas longer, but either way, most colonists are going to hear this type of message. It is a message that is going to be delivered in the revival style. Often they're not accepted in the more conservative Anglican churches. So many of these ministers are going to have to preach outdoors or in these new types of denominational churches that will accept this new style of preaching. So a couple of key leaders, people that we've already talked about in class. This is Jonathan Edwards. He focused on mostly throughout the state of Massachusetts, but he is going to travel. He did not believe in all of the false messages being spread of that we no longer need to worry about predestination, that you can save your own soul through good works. He is very worried that people are straying from the fact that predestination is real and God should be feared. And not only God, but hell is a very real place, and he can often paint a very ugly picture with that. And we are only going to get to heaven simply because of God's grace. Sermons are very emotional, very descriptive, and I'll show you what I mean by that. This is a quote from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I know we read some of this in class, and if you take a moment to look this over, you are going to realize that he is going to be describing that God holds us all in the palm of his hand, and it's truly up to him whether or not he will let us slip into hell or save us. So it's a pretty powerful, passionate quote, and it really does frighten people to go back to church and to believe that they do not have control over their souls and that they have to rely on God to save them. Another popular minister is George Whitefield. He's popular with the people, but not with his superiors. He starts preaching in the more conservative churches, but eventually will be forced out of those churches because his message in their eyes was controversial. So he also will be preaching either outdoors or into churches that will accept him. He covers quite a lot of territory, and it is estimated that he spoke to a quarter of all colonists in just 15 months. I think that historians believe that he covered about 5,000 miles and probably delivered over 350 sermons. His passionate delivery is very emotional as well, but people were very impressed that he memorized his sermons. The more kind of traditional ministers had them written down and would speak in a very monotone voice. He was just the opposite, and his sermons were so powerful that people would be whipped up into frenzies, passing out, crying. So this is a very visual display. His message is that humans are helpless, and we should always have to rely on God's greatness. Another quote to think about is that we are going to have to face judgment, and if we are not clothed in righteousness by God, then we are not going to get to heaven. So stop worrying about all the materialistic goods. Go back to what your parents and probably your grandparents taught you about focusing on just simply what is good. So his message is not, I guess, as frightening as probably Jonathan Edwards, but it's still just as passionate, and he's still just as colorful in his conversation, but he is very, very popular. So the lasting effects of the First Great Awakening leads to the creation of new denominations such as the Baptist faith. you're going to see churches that are already established become very competitive with each other to get more of a congregation, because a minister is only going to be as successful in terms of the numbers of people that are coming to church every Sunday. This is also going to create a division within these faiths between the old lights and the new lights. The old lights were the more traditional style ministers, and the new lights are the more, well, new style ministers that are going to be very passionate, very emotional, and tend to be more popular with so many of the congregations. Basically, they're not boring, and the old lights are incredibly boring. This also will encourage missionary work amongst Native Americans and slaves. If you recall, throughout the early colonial period, the English are not so much concerned about saving Native American souls as maybe the Spanish were. So there's very limited missionary work. This is going to reignite that spirit amongst the English to try to go and save the Native Americans. New schools are going to be opened. Now, we can see these names and think of pretty popular universities, very, very old universities, but they were not technically universities for everybody. They were first started to create this new wave of ministers. Most importantly, for our sake, it's the first spontaneous mass movement that is going to unify all 13 colonies. And if you recall from class, we talked about how each of these colonies is going to develop separately, have a shared culture, but then some. They also tend to vary, kind of depending on the region, depending on how they make their living. This is that first movement that is going to unify them, and it doesn't matter in terms of geographical boundaries or even cultural differences. This is pretty important that they start to share a similar experience, because eventually we need them to put down their differences and really unite against the British monarchy, and they need to learn how to do that. So this is pretty significant. Eventually, that spirit will get us to the American Revolution. All right, Second Great Awakening. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what times we're starting at, but anywhere from the early 1800s into about the 1840s. This is very similar in that it is a reaction to the growing popularity of that spirit of rationalism and also liberalism in faith. It's basically meaning that people are starting to think for themselves, inspired by the Enlightenment. A lot of our founding fathers were deists, and so therefore that concept is starting to carry over. Ministers are popular throughout the poor areas of the West and the South, but also parts of New England, and I will show you a map in a minute. The preaching style, again, is similar to the First Great Awakening in that it's very emotional. They often meet in open areas or tents, basically called tent revival or tent like camping, because they're out there for 3 or 4 days. So people would go, set up these large tents, and they would stay there for a few days to hear these ministers and see the public conversions. Okay, so this is the map I was referring to. So the area obviously on green is where you're going to see more of these events taking place, but the red lines obviously trace some of this movement and some of the camp revival meetings. The area that's kind of blue, shade in blue throughout the state of New York, that's called the Burnt Over District. That's where so many of these meetings are going to take place that hellfire had basically burnt over the district. All right, the key leader will be Charles Grandison Finney. Most of his work is going to be limited to the state of New York, again, the burnt over district, but also along the Erie Canal. So this is very different from the First Great Awakening, where you are going to be limited to the roads that are available to you. Here, he's able to access different towns with this new mode of transportation, right, the Erie Canal. He believes that individuals can control their own salvation, so very different from earlier thoughts about predestination. Right? And he thought that if people truly want God's grace, it is there for those of you who want it, and you just have to ask for it. But as soon as you are saved, it was your duty to improve your community and to help others. So First Great Awakening is a very personal experience. Second Great Awakening is a very public experience. So this is a quick quote from him, really encouraging you to save other souls. and that people are going to complain that it's not their responsibility, but it simply is. And if you take this up as a matter of study, you will realize that the kingdom of God is only going to happen because you make it happen. Right, the impact of the Second Great Awakening. Just this first slide, we're going to look at the impact on women, and that's why I chose that picture, because the women are front and center in this type of tent revival. Women are encouraged to participate in meetings, especially Charles Finney encouraged women to actually have their prayers out in the open and to be vocal about it. Very different from 100 years prior, where women are quiet and often really not included in that type of religious experience. They are a majority of the new church members that are taking place, mostly because the message that they're hearing gives them a new sense of purpose, and part of that purpose is to be the moral compass for their families and to get their husbands and their families back to church. This message is going to carry over not just in their spiritual life, but they will be encouraged to help others, and we'll talk about that in a minute. More things that will change. New denominations, such as the Mormons, and we talked about them in class. More missionary work, but not just with Native Americans. We will be exploring the Hawaiian Islands as well as various locations in Asia. So that picture there is was supposed to be in Hawaii. And a new debate over abolition, which is tied to the Second Great Awakening, is going to lead to new divisions within some of these denominations because they are split on whether or not slaves should be freed or kept as slaves. So you'll see this division between the northern and the southern branches of the Baptist or the Methodists. Basically, it's a precursor to the Civil War, that first religions will split. Eventually, you'll see the split within the political parties. And then, of course, the country itself. One of the more important impacts will be what we call the Age of Reform, that these men and women who have been converted now believe it is their job to help convert others and to save others who cannot save themselves. So obviously abolition becomes a very important cause for so many. Or temperance, which is to stop either the sale and or use of alcohol, which is really truly affecting so many women, because it is the husbands that are becoming the alcoholics and the women and children are suffering because of it, which also leads to women's rights. That picture there is supposed to be of a Seneca Falls Convention, where you have women basically asking for not just the right to vote, but the right to have their own lives, to basically own their own property, have control over their own salaries that they make. This is a pretty momentous event that we know is going to be a long time in coming for women to actually get the right to vote, but it starts here. Change in education. They want more boys and girls to go to school and to make those schools more accessible. And also prison reform. You think of Dorothea Dix when we talk about that and how she wanted to separate those that were mentally ill from those that were there because of murder or rape. So all of these things are happening, and so many people behind these reform movements are going to be women. We've covered this in class. I don't want to go over everything, but hopefully this will help you get ready for that essay. One last picture here, and I'm pretty sure I showed you guys this in class, but hopefully highlighting the fact that men and women are going to be sharing this experience in public together. This is more or less the Second Great Awakening, but that there's a lot of emotion in this painting, but there's also a lot of socializing going on. So these tent revivals are important, not just for personal conversion, but to get out and see other people that you probably would not be able to see, because most people are farmers and they are pretty much regulated to staying on their farms. So I hope this helps, and good luck on your test.